I met Clive a couple of years ago when he graced us with his presence at Lutheran Church in Paulsbo, and his story for me was real inspirational, and I know that tonight's event's going to inspire you as well. But my true hope today is that the stories that you'll hear and the information that you'll receive will move you to action to support Habitat for Humanity and action to help us build more homes. Without knowing it, Mr. Rainey began his affiliation with Habitat during a visit with friends in Georgia in 1976. Now remember, in 1976, we didn't have these electronic devices or digital cameras, but he was sitting there with his friends and seeing slides of a trip to Africa. You know, the slides where you slip them in and you slip them out. And he was being recruited and didn't even know it. But he was soon thereafter had his trips to Africa to where he was hooked and on his way. So he's been doing habitat activities for quite a while. But for Clive, it wasn't about building houses, it was about building lives. After hearing his story, you may be envious of the things he's been able to do in his life, but I know Clive will be the first one to let you know that it's been a blessing to be on this mission. So today he's going to tell us some things about his adventures, his challenges, and a multitude of blessings he's received from his experience. I've read some of the stories and looked at some of the YouTube videos, and I encourage you to do that as well and get a little bit more inspiration and information of his life story and commitment to Habitat. Answering the call to serve and performing the work he does has truly demonstrated his faith. Maybe we can't serve as he has, but we can demonstrate our own call to faith in the works that we can do here in Kitsap County. So please join me in welcoming Clive as he tells his story, his mission, and his dreams for the future of Habitat. Thank you.
Sheriff, you did a wonderful job. Thank you. Well, I have been a volunteer, well, not a volunteer all the time, but I have been involved with Habitat for Humanity 40 years. Last April the 1st was my 40th anniversary. You all know what April the 1st is, right? I like to tell people I was just the first fool to come along. Look at us now. And we would far more than fill this room if we had everybody who's been involved in those years come along. People make a big deal about the fact that I was the first, and yeah, there's some honor in that now, 40 years on. But I like to tell people, the real honor doesn't go to the first. The first is just a place in line. The real honor is going to the last volunteer, the one who lays that last block or nails that last nail and stands back, claps their hands together and says, job done. Everybody on earth has a decent place to live. For 40 years, I have longed to be that last volunteer, but it's not going to work out that way. It's going to be some generations down before we make that happen. But my job in life is to engage everybody I can in this and to encourage them and excite them about wanting to make that day come faster. Now, I came up a few weeks ago for an international conference, and by chance I was grabbed at the airport by friends from Washington and taken to Americus, Georgia, where we overnighted, and we went to President Carter's church that next morning because they hadn't been there. And so we were there, and there was a lot of noise about my 40 years with Habitat. And I kept saying to people, look around you. You see the people that have become engaged, President and Mrs. Carter and others, and how important and how powerful this vision has become. And they're all talking about, oh, we wish we could be like you. We wish we could be like you. And I go, you are like me, and I am like you. I am just blood and flesh. Don't make a saint out of me, because it's a terrible place to have to live if they make a saint out of you. But there were two people who come every year in the wintertime to volunteer with Habitat International, and they were there at the church service. And the man came up to me, and I don't think he realized what he was saying to me. He said, oh, they did a really nice write-up about you. He works in our print shop, so he had seen it. They did a really nice write-up about you, but your name tag just says volunteer. And it's like, just says volunteer? That's who we are. That's what we do. It's the greatest title I know in Habitat for Humanity. I started as a volunteer for 7.5 years, and I have been working for the last 7 years as a volunteer, just as hard every single day as I ever worked when I was on the payroll, because I have a passion for this thing and I want to see it keep going. Well, the theme we work with these days is through shelter, we empower. And that reflects in all of our lives as well as in the lives of homeowners. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to a youth group in Atlanta, and a lady came up to me when I got there and she said, "My son is going to be introducing you tomorrow night." I found this a little strange, that mama's coming up to talk to me and say, "My son's going to introduce you." And she said, "He's going to come up to you tomorrow and he's going to ask you some questions, and just tolerate the questions. They may be obnoxious, but he's just a young kid, you know. So he's going to, fine, just send him on up." So the next day, this little guy comes up, and he is little because everybody else there is high school and college. This little guy's little. And I'm thinking, man, he's little for a high school kid. And he asked me questions, and yes, some of them were what little kids would be interested in. But that night, he steps to the podium to introduce me. And his first words knocked the breath out of me. He said, "My name is Trinity, and I'm growing up in a Habitat house." I hadn't been prepared for that I was going to be introduced by a kid who was growing up in a Habitat house. But I got up there and made it through my speech, and at the end of my speech, I told a story about a young man from Sisters, Oregon, who grew up in a Habitat house, and who tells the story of having been chosen when he was in the 10th, he was 10 years old, for a Habitat home with his family. And he said, "My sisters and I were too young to build the house. We were not allowed to be on the build site, but we planted the apple trees in the yard. And we've enjoyed many apples from those trees over the years." And he goes on in that vein, and then all of a sudden he says, "And now, today, well, not exactly today, but in a few months, I'm going to graduate a doctor from Harvard University." I came to Habitat out of a classroom in South Georgia, teaching 7th and 8th graders, not a single one of whom could read their own name. And having a young girl say to me one day, "Why do we have to learn this old stuff anyway?" Well, what 7th grader hadn't asked that question, except a few of the little overachievers. But, you know, the others are like, "Why do we have to learn this old stuff?" And I said what any one of us would have said, because if you get an education, you'll have a better life. And she came back at me like that and said, "Yeah, that's what they told my mama." So that evening I went to see her mama and found them living in a cornfield there in South Georgia, in a shack that probably dated right back to the time of slavery or just thereafter. There were no doors, no windows, no running water, no electricity, and no hope. And Millard Fuller had already shown me that slideshow and said, you know, in his peculiar voice, "I know the next volunteer for Zaire is in this room tonight." And I went to him and I said, "You win. I'm going to waste my life in classrooms like that." Now, Judah Sofkowski from down at Sisters is just one of many examples. We hear about them all the time. Harvard, Cornell, you name it, they're going there. These wonderful places to go to school that grew up in Habitat houses. And they know it was from that house. I've had people say to me, "Oh, those kids, they would have made it anyway." Those kids don't believe that. They know how critical that house was to their learning. And so here I am with little Trinity. I tell this story, and when I finish and come down off the stage, he comes running up to me and he says, "I'm in the 8th grade and I'm going to Duke University Law School on a full scholarship." And I'm like, "Wait, what?" And he says, no, I'm still in the 8th grade. I got a lot to do before I get there, but I'm going to Duke University Law School on a full scholarship. And here comes Mama again. And she says, "He will too." She says, "We were in a shelter for abused women and children when Habitat found us." And she said, they had encouraged us to try for a house. And then the Habitat selection folks came and they sat and talked with us. And she said, they said, "You're going to have to help build your house." And she said at that moment, everything just shrunk for me, because I didn't know how to do that. And that abusive husband had told her, you are nobody, you aren't anything, you can't do anything, you can't learn anything. He had abused her in that way for years. And she said, all that came back to me. And I didn't think I could do it. Then get ready. She says, then Habitat put that hammer in my hand and taught me how to use it. And as I built my house, I built myself. She said, I went back to school, I got my GED. I now have a 4-year college degree. And that boy right there, he is going to Duke University Law School on a full scholarship. That's what we're about. That's what we do. Some staff member years ago, and nobody actually remembers who was clever enough to say this, but said that Habitat houses are trampolines. They're not just safety nets. People's lives don't come to rest and they hang there in the hammock and go, nothing more to do. No, they bounce off that foundation and they go out and they become somebody in their community. And I literally could go on all night with stories that I know of that sort. A couple of years ago, I was up here in the Northwest, and I was speaking in Beaverton, Oregon, and I was supposed to go by a build site or something that morning. I got there too early, so I stopped somewhere to get a cup of coffee, and there was one of those little neighborhood newspapers. You know, they're everywhere now. So I pulled it off the rack and started flipping through it, and there was a story about a woman who was building a tiny house, and the newspaper had interviewed her. And they said, well, why are you building yourself a tiny house? And she said, because I've been through 2 divorces and I don't have a lot left and I'm nearing retirement age and I figure this is my best shot. This is my best solution for housing, at least for the immediate future. And the day they were there interviewing her, she was installing a hot water heater. And they said, well, how'd you learn to install a hot water heater? And she said, you ever hear of YouTube? She said, you just go on there and they show you how to do everything. And she said, but the greatest help I've had came from my friend, let's say her name was Jane, who has been volunteering with Habitat for Humanity for years, and she knows how to do these things. Empowerment, impact. Women are going to have a chance to do it this weekend on the site out at Port Orchard when they get to build together. And maybe there'll be somebody there who's afraid to pick up the hammer because they've never used one. They don't know how to hold it. You know, they're going to be choking it to death. But somebody else, perhaps another woman, is going to say, you know, you'll get a lot more power out of that if you pull your hand down here and use your whole arm and get the powerful swing of that to nail those nails. People are going to learn. This is why Home Depot and Lowe's love Habitat for Humanity. We've turned an awful lot of ordinary folks into builders. And they can come there and fix up a room in their house or whatever it is that they do, simply from the skills that they've learned at Habitat. We are about empowering people, empowering the folks who get the houses as well as the people who build the houses. And that's very important for us. Some of you will remember, all of you probably know this book, but you will remember having at least referred to it, if not read it, in high school or in college by a Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to this country in the early years of this country and wrote a book called Democracy in America. And his key principle was that voluntary association was what builds democracy. People who have worked together, served on committees together, served on boards together, are empowered. There's no telling how many people have gone on into political life from having been involved in Habitat and seeing just the issue of housing and followed that. But it is as we build together that we build ourselves, we build our communities, we build our world. Now, I happen to live in Guatemala. And there, I don't build so many houses anymore. I've got a little back problem, so it's a little tiresome picking up 10-pound blocks all day long. So I've switched to something else. Excuse me. And I've switched to it for 2 reasons. One is that my back gives me problems. And 2 is that the houses we build don't reach the poorest of the poor. The house we build in Guatemala now, in order to be safe against earthquakes and such, costs $6,000. But we can do much more for very poor families by building a latrine, by building a safe stove, by providing them with a water filter. Those three elements eliminate 30 very real diseases from those lives. It means mama's not going to get cataracts from the smoke that comes from the stove or the 3 blocks or rocks that she cooks on outside or inside her house. Now the smoke is eliminated. By the way, the safe stoves, and there are many models of them, every last one of them, by our educated standards, says that they can eliminate more than 75% of the wood, save 75% of the wood that women use. Well, that's good for you and me sitting up here in America. That's less terrible things being added to the air. That's less trees being cut and more carbon being captured. Now, when you talk to a woman in Guatemala, she doesn't know from 75%. She's probably uneducated if she's gotten one of those stoves. But she will tell you very clearly it cuts it in half. It cuts it in half, and if that's the standard, that's good enough. So that we're using those and eliminating the smoke. I have a friend in my town, my little village, who is the medical health commissioner and runs the clinic there. And I had a group down from Oregon last year, and we had him speaking to the group. And I said, well, tell us what your chief concerns are. What are the chief illnesses that you face at the clinic? First, he said, is pulmonary, lung issues. Second is stomach issues. And third is eye issues. So when he finished, I said, well, tell us, we build these healthy house kits is what we call them. So people can live in very poor conditions, but we can eliminate those issues from their lives. And he looked at me and said, I just told you, lung, stomach, and eyes, you are my first line of defense in this community. You are the thing that allows me to manage illness in this community because you stop so much of it in its tracks. My own grandfather, whom I never met, he died before I was born, was a medical health commissioner in South Georgia. And he was charged with eliminating malaria from South Georgia, which was a problem in those days. In my growing up years, there were still people who remembered him, and they used to say, your grandfather was a hero, he got rid of malaria here. But he was also charged with eliminating other parasitic-borne diseases. And one of the things he did was to teach people to build a simple concrete platform to use for their outhouse. Remember, there wasn't indoor plumbing, white, black, or any other situation in the South at that time. People didn't have it. So a lot of people used outhouses, and he simply taught them to have a decent platform that could be cleaned. I have often in my life in Africa, when I worked there, because my grandmother used to tell me that he was in the Depression times. He didn't get rich. He got paid with chickens and collard greens and whatever people had. And years ago, when I was as Africa Director of Habitat, and we were around 33 villages around one big lake there, we would visit the lake, and the people would come to me and they'd bring me a goat, or they'd bring me a big stalk of bananas. And I really felt I was continuing my grandfather's work. I was certainly continuing the way he got thanked for his work. But I have often felt that old phrase that I was standing on the shoulders of a giant. I was standing on his shoulders. Well, back in January, a group from University UCC, United Church of Christ, in Seattle, came to build with us. And we were building stoves that week. So we went around and built stoves everywhere. And we built stoves at a particular house where there were 2 little boys who didn't have a father. They lived with their mother in a little wooden cabin. It's a pretty decent little house. It's got a cement floor, so it's safe. They have a tiny little sister. And they got into coming up and goosing us and playing around, you know, the way the little kids like to do. And I got to be friends with them. And we built their mother a safe stove. And then we went on our way because we had many more things to do. A few weeks later, people came from Plymouth United Church of Christ, a sister church in Seattle. And they came, and we wound up going back to this house to build a latrine. Now, I may not be good with laying blocks and such, but I'm a devil with a saw. And when we're cutting those wood boards, I tell people, stand back, I'll get the boards cut, you know. But I love this humble, simple work. And obviously, I sense that my grandfather is being part of my life as I'm building these outhouses. But the day I built this outhouse, I didn't feel I was standing on my grandfather's shoulders. I felt him standing on my shoulders. As I said to him, look, Gramps, far beyond South Georgia and Mitchell County, far beyond the United States, and even into Central America, here we are building around the world, helping people to have a decent place to live. Along the way, I've also become very good friends with little Ronnie and Andres. I have a very large adopted family in the town where I live. Now I have to play traitor to them and go out and be the father figure to these little guys, because I just hurt so for them when they don't have a father and they just cling to you. But the day we were making the latrine, little Ronnie, who's 10 years old, was sitting on the ground with this really puzzled look on his face. So I went over and I sat down near him, and he scooted over against me, and what little boys do down there, they have real physical contact with whoever they see as their father figure. And one of the contact points is knee to knee. They just jam it right up against you. So Ronnie scoots over, jams his knee up against mine, and then he says, I don't see the taza for this thing. The taza translates as bowl. You understand that in the context of a toilet. And I say, it's just a simple molded piece of plastic. It's always blue. You buy them in hardware stores everywhere. He said, where's the taza? And I said, well, Ronnie, they didn't bring the taza today because we're doing block work around the base of the thing. And that block work, until it dries, won't tolerate the door swinging and closing. So they withhold the taza for a while, and they'll bring it to you in a few days. And he looks at me and he goes, I want to use it. He was not in instant need. He was not sitting there desperate for this. He knew how to go off in the bushes, as he had done for a long time. He had just heard so much about this great thing that was coming. Well, what would you do if you get a new iPhone or a new car? You want to use it, you know? So I said, well, patience, just a few more days and it'll come. But the real power of that came when we finished building that latrine that afternoon. And we got ready to leave. Ronnie and Andres are climbing all over me crying because they think it's the last time they're going to see me. And I'm saying, no, guys, I know where you live. I can get back here. I'll bring books and share them with you and the other kids and stuff. But the mother stands up to thank us for what we had done. And she began to weep, and she said, now I won't have to worry, because she also has a little girl about that big. And she says, I won't have to worry when in the middle of the night my little girl has to go outside. I will know where she's going. She's not going down that hillside into those bushes when it's pouring rain, when I might not hear her cries if something happened. This outhouse will give us safety and dignity. That's enough to keep me going for another 70 years, building outhouses and being happy to help those families. So we do that in our global village trips in Guatemala and other places around the world. Your affiliate has not done many global village trips. You tithe, I don't know how many of you know that, but international affiliates, in order to be part of Habitat, part of the deal is you say, okay, we're going to send some of what we raise to help build a house somewhere else. And Lebanon has been your focus for some time, is that correct? Jordan, I'm sorry, Jordan. So that's a long way to go. I hope still that you will organize yourselves and go to Jordan, because you won't believe the experience that you have. It is so powerful and so critical in the world we live in today that people say, okay, it is a long way to go. It's going to take me extra days, and it's going to take extra money to go, because you pay your own way to go. But how critical is it? You know, you can come to Guatemala, where I live, a pretty safe Christian country, if you will, Catholic and Protestant. Jordan is not a Christian country. There are Christians there. But Jordan in today's world is a Muslim country. We need people who are willing to go to places like that, who can come home and say later, when someone starts to talk badly about Muslims or others, wait a minute, you're talking about my friend Mohammed. I just built his house recently. I'll tell you a powerful example of that from Americus, Georgia. Years ago, we built what was designated as the 20,000th house of Habitat for Humanity. Now we're over millions. But years ago, this was 20,000th house. And the board of a local bank had decided they were going to sponsor house number 20,000. The president of their bank was a man I had known for many years. He was a terrible racist. We were building for an African-American family. He didn't have any option but to come out and help build. And so he was sitting there with an African-American woman, the homeowner. Now, Phil had never known African-Americans except in servant roles. Yard man, woman washing the clothes, fixing the meals, changing his clothes maybe when he was little. He had never known them in any other role than that. And he was known for the terrible racist jokes that he told. But now he's up on a rooftop of a Habitat house. You know, every spiritual leader of every religion I can think of has at one time or another been up on a mountaintop and had a mountaintop experience, because who doesn't have a spiritual experience when you get up on top of a mountain and you can see everything and commune with nature and commune with God. Habitat for Humanity can't give you mountaintop experiences, but we can give you rooftop experiences. And he's on this roof with this woman. And he starts a conversation with her, a very honest conversation. And he says, so I'm happy to be here helping build your house, but how come you're dependent upon Habitat for Humanity to build your house? She points down off the roof and she says, you see that little 9-year-old girl down there? She said, when I was in high school, I messed around. I got pregnant. I had to quit school. And I never finished my high school diploma. And my life has been off the tracks economically since then. Phil looks at her and says, do you want that to happen to that little girl? And this woman, like any mother, said, good God, no. And here's the magic. Phil looked this woman in the eye and said, then what are you and I going to do about that? What are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen to her? Phil would die several years later with a brain tumor. He never told another racist joke, nor would he allow anybody to say one to him. He would just hold up his hand and say, not now. You're talking about my friend. That's why I want you to go to Jordan. I want you to go there and meet people who are not like you, that you can come home to and defend when people say they are terrible, every last one of them is a terrorist, or whatever it may be. And I'm not talking about your politics now, I'm talking about that national paranoia that we have. Sometimes we get that opportunity when we're here. A few years ago, I was on a street corner in West Louisville, Kentucky. I was there to help dedicate a house. By the way, my great-great-grandmother was from that town. But I was there, and we were dedicating a house, and that house was built for a Muslim family who were refugees from Somalia. The house was sponsored by Jewish Healthcare together with St. Mary's Healthcare. I think you get the picture, right? We stood around that house and we held hands. An imam prayed, a rabbi prayed, and a priest prayed. And we did the only thing our common Creator ever asked of us. We loved the Lord our God with all our hearts, our souls, our minds, our hands, if you will, and we loved our neighbors as ourselves. That is what we're called to do. And sometimes, just in the course of building a house with rough boards and nails and a few blocks, we are lifted off whatever that street corner is and into the headlines of the world. Not that it's on television the next day or in the newspapers, but we are lifted into that place of prophecy that says that is where we belong. That's what Habitat has been about from day one. It's what we do now. It is how we build our houses, our communities, our world, and ourselves. Thank you for listening to a few old stories. I'm willing to answer questions for a bit if you like afterwards, but thank you for coming. Thank you for what you have done in the past. Thank you for what you will do in the future. God bless you and keep up the great work. Amen.
We've learned a lot of things over the years. Habitat's been around for 40 years, 25 years in this county alone. And we build, as Clive said, we build way more than just houses. We build communities, and we build neighborhoods now. This neighborhood in Port Orchard has 32 homes, solar panels on the roof. Habitat's the largest green home builder in the nation. And it's just a beautiful neighborhood. All the vegetation, when the neighborhood's done, all the vegetation on the common property will be edible. We're going to start building another house up here in Kingston later this year, and some more in Port Orchard. But you ought to come see these houses. They're pretty cool. When you pull into the neighborhood, if it's a sunny day, you're going to hear somebody yell, "Car!" because there's like 46 kids living in the neighborhood already. And so make sure you grab some information on us. Give us a call. We'll take you out on a tour. Some of you I've already invited out on a tour, but you got to come out and see it. So thanks, everybody, for coming. We appreciate it. And thank you, Clive, for sharing with us. And we're all going to hang around if you have some more questions. Thanks, everybody.